like to call to order the Planning Commission meeting for Monday, April 10th, 2023. Could we have a roll call, please? Leek? Present.
Stewart?
Here.
Heap?
Here.
Mitchell is excused. Moreno?
Here.
Phillips? Rigby?
Here.
And Councillor Afghan is also with us.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Segueing into that, good evening, Councillor Afghan. Would you like to give us your update?
Good evening, commissioners. Of course, there was an executive session to discuss extending funds and the scope of work for the wastewater treatment plant design from 60% to 90%. That was approved. There was proclamation of Earth Day 2023 and several items on the consent agenda. For example, DRC decision for the bus barn, Lake Oswego School District bus barn, and annexations. There were at least one public comment about pickleball and how the comprehensive plan and Parks and Recreation guidelines that ties the neighborhood needs into what should happen in the neighborhood. There wasn't much more conversations at the council, and that session was closed, and Laura conversation was opened up, and then the council or Laura adopted resolution of the LO redevelopment agency for adjusting the budget, appropriate resources, and making adjustment to the budget. And this was mainly because there were projects that were supposed to be sold, but the time has been delayed, like North Anchor project, which was supposed to be sold by now, but it didn't. So the budget had to be reappropriated to make sure the projects move forward. I wasn't personally in the meeting, but I have watched the recording and I've read the meeting minutes. Are there any questions for me?
Commissioner Moreno? Councilor Moreno?
Maybe the buttons are wrong. I pushed my button.
Okay.
In the wrong spot.
No, Commissioner Heap?
Thank you. So just a couple of comments. One, I'd like to say thanks to council staff, the Sustainability Advisory Board. I noticed the Avenue A chargers are back open again. The proprietary manufacturer charger had got removed. And so I think that's great that the city's made progress on that. It really helps out with sustainability and providing charging options to folks that don't have the option of home charging. I still think we got it wrong in terms of like the parking fees. So, you know, for people that live in multifamily housing, you know, they need to charge to 80, 85%. And then when they're done, they need to get off and let somebody else charge. But currently the way it's structured is that parking fees are charged after 2 hours, which doesn't allow some people to fully charge. So great improvements there, but I'd like to see maybe the parking fees changed more from a parking fee to an idle fee. Once you're done charging, you get off and you allow somebody else to charge. But thanks to everybody for getting the chargers back in commission. And then maybe a second comment was I saw in the forecast and also some of the minutes that council looked at our LU 22-0058, the 1710 South Shore Road rezoning application that went to public hearing on April 4th, and then it's going to findings, conclusions, and order on April 18th. I would just like to comment, I think the city got it wrong, and I know the Plan Commission recommended that too. And the main issue there is that I think we're being inconsistent in our zoning across the city. So in this case, as I had mentioned previously, we were looking at downzoning. And so downzoning is reducing the ratio of housing units per acre when we're going the opposite direction. So As we look at the housing inventory tonight, and we look at, some of our objectives to make more affordable housing and middle housing, I feel like we really went in the opposite direction there. And there was some unintended consequences. As the states created kind of our middle housing guidelines, that was played to basically result in a situation where instead of getting, higher density, more affordable housing, the result will be.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but you asked me if it was okay to talk about that. It's fine. However, Commissioner Afghan has not yet adopted the findings, and so I think it would be an ex parte communication for him to listen to this. So if you're going to continue on, we probably should excuse Commissioner Afghan from Counselor Afghan.
Well, I think I can stop here and then wait till the council has adopted the final findings, conclusions in order after the next meeting. So thank you. I have concerns, but I'll wait.
Okay.
That's it. Thanks, Shirley.
Okay, thank you. We do have a little bit of a confusion on who's on which 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got Commissioner Moreno on 1, and Commissioner Heap was the one who buzzed in, so I don't. Okay. Anyone else like to ask questions of Councilor Afghan? Just real quickly, could you explain to me the neighborhood? You talked about the neighborhood tennis and what a neighborhood. There was could you elaborate on that a little, please?
I think I mentioned that on the public comment regarding pickleball.
Oh, it was a public comment.
Yes, it was a public comment. Someone from Westlake who had done some research about what does the comprehensive plan says and what does the Parks and Recreation guidelines says, and they were trying to tie that all together, which I think we should stand back and look at the bigger picture and what all the documents do say and how they tie together, and not make decisions on the fly. Similar to what the other commissioner was saying about if our intent are going to be doing X, we got to be consistent with doing X.
So let me just also interrupt, sorry. So that matter, that's a conditional use application that the City Parks Department either has filed or will be filing shortly. So that matter could go before Councilor Afghan. And so I don't want to get any ex parte contacts.
No, I'm not going
to
dialogue on it. I just wanted a little clarification of what
he heard.
Segment he heard, yeah, and that answers it. So thank you very much. And seeing go ahead. Seeing no other questions for Councilor Afghan, I thank you very much for that feedback. It was great. And we'll move on to any public comment. Anybody online? Because I don't see anybody in the audience. Okay.
Chair Leek, if you don't mind, I will be in the background listening to the conversation.
Okie dokie. Thank you very much. I have several announcements for Commission for Citizens Involvement. We have the Blue Heron Neighborhood Association on Thursday, April 20th at 7 p.m. And the police department is going to present on neighborhood safety. And if you have any questions, contact your neighborhood association there. We also have the Palisades Neighborhood Association Annual General Meeting on Wednesday, April 19th from 6 to 8 p.m. at Park Academy at 1950 South Shore Boulevard. We have the Forest Highlands Neighborhood Association Annual Membership Meeting and election of members of the Board of Directors on Sunday, April 23rd from 3 to 5 at the Boca Raton Community Center. And then we also have the Oak Creek Neighborhood Association is meeting Monday, April 17th at 7:00 p.m. at the Oak Creek Elementary School, and they will be discussing the pickleball courts proposed at Westlake Park. And then we need to approve number 6, the minutes from March 27th. Do we have any additions or corrections from the minutes for that meeting? I'm not so sure I received those. Did you? I don't think we've
I
received.
didn't receive them, and I was absent at the meeting too, so I'd abstain, but I didn't see them. I looked for them.
Okay. Yeah, we didn't receive the minutes for March 27th, so we won't be moving to approve them. And now we will table them. Thank you. And then we move on to our work session, Housing Needs and Production Strategies, House Bill 2003, work session number 3, PP 22-0005.
Thank you, Chair Leek. I'm Erik Olson, long-range planning manager with the City of Lake Oswego. I know you all are familiar with me, but I'm joined today by our consultant team, or a couple folks from our consultant team that's been working with us on the housing needs analysis work. So I'm joined by Andrew Parrish from MIG, as you can see on the screen there, as well as Brendan Buckley from Johnson Economics, who will be helping out with another portion of the meeting. But I can go over the few intro slides, I suppose, Andrew, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen. Andrew will have the presentation.
All right, just want to make sure you can hear me and see the screen here.
We can hear you. All right, thanks. And just before I hand it over to Andrew, or actually I'll hand it over to Brendan to go over the first portion of this presentation. I just point out that here tonight, we're wanting to present to the Planning Commission some information that we've been presenting to various different groups over the course of the last few weeks. This is primarily just a presentation of the findings of the initial drafts that we produced for the housing needs analysis. So primarily focused on the draft housing capacity analysis, as well as the draft residential buildable lands inventory. So I will start out with a little bit of a summary of what we've done in terms of public engagement, and then hand it over to the consultant team for the rest of the project, and hopefully, or rest of the presentation. Hopefully we can get questions and answers handled as well. So with respect to public engagement, as I mentioned, we had a few events in the last couple of weeks, notably a virtual neighborhood forum last Thursday, April 6th, in addition to the Housing Production Strategy Task Force's second meeting, which was held on March 24th. Essentially, we covered similar information that we're hoping to cover with you tonight, really about the findings of the draft buildable lands inventory, housing capacity analysis, and really, are we missing anything? Just trying to ask general questions if we're on the right track, or if we need to sort of take another look at anything prior to moving on to the final drafts. So I would just remind folks here and just put out an open call for folks to check out the online open house. We actually also have an online website. It's kind of like a survey, as well as a nice sort of straightforward way to go through the information available on our website. So if folks have an opportunity, please take a look at the online open house and provide your input. Some written input would be great. And we're going to leave that open until April 21st. So please share that with your networks, and try to get folks that that are living in Lake Oswego or working in Lake Oswego to answer those questions for us and help us get some input. So I guess I would just also add that, obviously tonight we have a presentation of the Planning Commission here, and then we're also next week on Tuesday, the 18th of April, going to be talking with the City Council about similar information. So really just looking for Planning Commission input and going through the information with you all tonight.
Could I ask what the final bottom line, after we have gone through all the information and the data, what is it we're trying to establish? Just what land in Lake Oswego is buildable?
That's a part of it, but it's really just kind of something that we'll go over tonight in very great detail, but essentially looking at the needs in Lake Oswego in terms of number of units and what sort of income distribution or sort of income range they're needed at, as well as our anticipated amount of buildable acres in the city. So we looked at, not only which land is buildable, but what do we expect in terms of rates depending on the different zone and depending on the different sort of components of that site that we've looked at. So it's a little bit more complicated than just outlining the number of acres that could be built, really looking at what we expect to happen more.
And
based on what's happened previously.
If these lands are held privately, how does the city mandate their wish to have X amount of affordable housing units meet this income group here? And,
Well, we can design our strategies. There are a number of, about 100 different strategies that have been made available to cities, at least, pre-existing strategies. Of course, we could come up with our own strategies. They might not exist yet. But there are a number of different strategies that are designed to accommodate cities that might be land constrained, that might be, dealing with similar issues that we're dealing with, but could still be actions that the city could take to promote needed housing, whether they be incentives for something like middle housing, if we determine that that's what we need, or incentives for other types of development, sort of that we are looking to encourage or incentivize. So, I don't get the sense that the state will be holding us to a specific number of units. I really don't think that's what this is about. However, I think this is about manageable goals that we can actually track and achieve. So they might not look like, things that are outside of the purview of the city, such as housing development, which is somewhat within the purview of the city, but for the most part, not within the purview of the city. They could look like really specific numbers if we do have some property that we want to make some targets for. But otherwise, it wouldn't necessarily look like commitments to a certain number of units that the city would be making.
okay, thank you.
And Andrew, if you have anything to add to that, please go ahead.
Yeah, really good questions right off the bat. I think what I'm going to go through in this presentation and what we're going to talk about is kind of the technical analysis piece that's going to frame up a lot of that discussion of, okay, so what do we do about these numbers? What do we do about the land base that we see on the ground here? So the kind of strategies, what does the state expect and what is the city actually willing to do? That's sort of a later step, but all of this flows directly into that. So I'm just going to go over real quickly. It's a good segue into the summary of the process that we're undertaking now. So in this piece of the housing needs analysis, we are looking at a projection of housing needs. So the demand side, and you've seen this slide before, the demand side of the equation, an inventory of buildable lands, and a reconciliation of those the demand and the supply for the city. And so with that information, the city can go forward and say, okay, what's our strategy to address housing needs? How does what we want to accomplish kind of match with the land base that we have, and what might that entail ultimately? So right now we have a kind of a preliminary draft of the housing needs projection and of the buildable lands inventory. There are still several pieces that are in flux and at play. So we want to kind of get your sense of, do we have the right set of assumptions in place currently, or what are the big things we need to be looking out for, because you know the community much better than we do. And as we go forward, we can we'll have more meetings with you all and with the housing task force and with the public to discuss these later steps here. So just a reminder about the timeline of this project. We started in kind of fall of last year. We are working through the housing needs and the buildable lands inventory through March and April. We will be finalizing this technical piece of the report through about summer, and then in late summer and fall, we're going to be talking to you again about what strategies are there that the state suggests, what other strategies might be on the table, and these are things like rezoning land or providing incentives for certain kinds of development. There's a lot of strategies, and we'll be talking about them with you all. And ultimately coming out with a report in summer of next year that is kind of the wrap up of all of this. So I'm going to pass it off to Brendan Buckley with Johnson Economics to talk a bit about the demand side, the housing needs analysis. And then we'll take a break after that discussion and talk about any questions you have. So I'll be moving the slides here, and take it away, Brendan, please.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Brendan Buckley. I'm with Johnson Economics. We partner with MIG on a lot of these housing studies around the region and the state over many years now. And my work on this has to do with sort of the technical analysis on coming up with a demand forecast over the next 20 years for housing, and then that is compared to the buildable lands inventory that Andrew will be talking about in a little while. So to come up with a forecast of housing needs, we draw on a ton of different sources really to try to synthesize the best picture that we can get of the current housing inventory, demographics, and what the future population might look like, and what type of housing they might need. Very important part of this process to sort of keep in mind from the outset is that the state rules for how to do this type of study, which applies to every city in the state, it has a specific source that we're supposed to use for our forecast of both population and households 20 years from now. And that comes from the Metro Coordinated Population Forecast that they do with all of the cities within the Metro boundary. So Metro goes through the process of forecasting their amount of total growth in the entire UGB, and then they go through a process with all the different cities of trying to allocate that out and determine where that growth might take place. And so Lake Oswego, like all the cities in Metro, went through that process in 2018. The time for redoing that is coming up pretty quickly, I believe. But basically, that's when the current forecast was worked on. It was adopted in 2021, and Metro then is providing these numbers that we are required to use for this process. So that's how we've come up with the growth rate, and I'll talk more about that. These are all the other sources. We rely heavily on the census. Luckily, there was the 2020 decennial census recently. That's the best sort of data with the lowest margin of error. Then we use American Community Survey for many things. That's the census survey that they do in the intervening years, but there's a higher margin of error. And we put all these things together and do.
Could you speak up just a little bit, please?
Yeah, I can sure try. Can you hear me at all?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's just a little better.
Okay. Next slide. So the methodology for the housing needs analysis portion is to assess the current housing and demographic conditions, trying to come up with a picture of your current inventory and the needs of your current population and households. Now, that profile is often close, but it doesn't always match exactly. And sometimes we find that based on the demographic trends and breakdown of your households, that perhaps the amount of ownership or rental housing you have doesn't quite match up with what we would expect the population would need, or the pricing of your current housing doesn't match up exactly with what the current population would need. So that's why we do sort of the current comparison, and then we do the demographically driven projections, again looking at heading towards that number in 2043 that we get from Metro, and then come up with a forecast or estimate about what types of housing might be needed in terms of the form of housing: single family homes versus duplexes versus townhomes versus apartments, etc. So we'll be getting to that more in a moment. Next slide. So in the preliminary draft we have so far, this is a breakdown of the population figures and household figures and the projection for 20 years into the future. So the figures for the year 2000 and 2023 are derived mostly from the census population. In order to update the population to 2023, we use the PSU Population Research Center, which comes up with estimates for the cities all around the state. And so This is the current profile. Right now you have a population of about 41,500 people living in 17,500 households. And your number of housing units there are 18,000 and a little over 300. So by 2043, the projection calls for very little population growth. And this is part of the issue of what we're finding using the Metro forecast, is that their forecast for your growth is quite low. And once we factor in the growth that's already happened between 2018, roughly, when that forecast was derived, and 2023, where we are now, once we look at the amount of growth that's already happened, that reduces the amount of future growth even further. So you can see that the amount of forecasted growth over this 20-year period is a little over 400 people. 1% growth, that's not much. And in terms of households, however, the growth rate for that period is projected to be a little over 1,800 households. And the reason that's so much larger is because the average household size is projected to keep falling, which is sort of a long-term secular trend. So right now you have an average household size of 2.4 people. That's projected to fall to an average size of under 2.2 people by 2043. And so what that means is the population, while not much larger, needs more units, more households to accommodate it, because it's more smaller households. In terms of the needed housing units, there's a little under 2,000 units needed. That would be 11% growth over your current housing inventory. The reason that the number of housing units needed is larger than the number of projected new households is because we also assume that you need some vacancy built into your housing inventory. We use an assumption of 5%, and that means that renters and home buyers who are shopping around have some selection to choose, but that vacancy rate is not so high that it's a burden on property managers. It's not excess vacancy as far as apartments are concerned. So again, the forecasted annual growth rate for Metro is a very low, under 0.1% per year. So that's why we're getting to that sort of low population forecast that you see there. Next slide. In terms of incomes in Lake Oswego, I don't think there's a lot of surprise here. It is a high average income community. The median household income is 40% higher than the rest of the county, and 75% higher than the state median household income. So again, I don't know how surprising this is, but in addition, the growth since the year 2000 has grown about, we'll just round it and say it's grown about 75%. That has outpaced inflation quite a bit. So it continues to, it's not just a prosperous community, but it continues to be a more prosperous, increasingly prosperous community. Next slide. This is a representation of commuting trends. So in the middle there, you see the 2,250 workers, roughly, both live and work in Lake Oswego. The rest of the workers in your local employers commute in from elsewhere. That's the orange arrow. So it's almost 21,000 workers who are employed in Lake Oswego are coming in from outside of the community, and you can see that represents about 90% of the local jobs. But a similar trend is happening on the other end, where almost 16,000 people who live in Lake Oswego work elsewhere. They're either commuting out. Some of these folks work remotely. You see there's a lot of turnover there. This is a common pattern that you see in the metro area. It's not that unusual because the communities are so sort of enmeshed with each other and obviously nearby each other. So you see a lot of crossover. There are 1.3 jobs located in Lake Oswego, estimated per local household, whereas each household only has an average of one working member per household. So there are more jobs available locally than you have folks working in Lake Oswego. Next slide. So just a quick profile of your current housing conditions in the community. You have 71% home ownership rate. That exceeds what you see statewide, which is about 65%, and then 29% renters. So you have a little bit higher ownership rate and a little lower rental rate. Most ownership units are 3 or more bedrooms, and most rental units are 2 or fewer bedrooms. That's pretty common pattern as well. And then on the right there, what you see is a breakdown between owner occupied units in green and renter occupied units in orange of the estimate of sort of what type of units those are. So at the top, you see that 81% of owner occupied units are estimated to be single family detached houses. The rest are sort of a mixture of different types of attached homes. Single attached there means townhomes. And then for the rental supply, almost 60% are rental units are located in properties that have at least 5 units on them, so apartment complexes. And then the remainder are different types of sort of smaller properties, but a full 18%, close to 20%, we'll say, are also rented single family homes as well. So that's also, those homes also make up an important part of the rental inventory. Next slide. The age of your housing stock, you'll see that sort of the bulk of the housing stock was built in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, less so before that or after that. There's not a ton of difference between the owner and owner occupied and renter occupied in that respect. I guess slightly larger share of your rental units were built in the 80s and 90s. But then you look at, we get into the 2000s, still, you know, close to 10% were built in the early 2000s and an additional 10% built in the 2010s. And so you do still see housing production ongoing. Next slide. So getting to our 20-year forecast, as I mentioned on the first slide, the number of new units needed is approaching 2,000. It's 1,968 estimated units specifically. That's 11% growth in the housing inventory that you have now. And right now, on the right, you see a breakdown of the unit types. This is a preliminary sort of breakdown. This is the makeup of future units going forward is part of what we talk about through this process to see if any of the policies or strategies we come up with might impact what this makeup of future housing might be. So, but right now, you see that there are still many single-family detached homes projected, but also a greater mix going forward of attached types of housing, from apartment complexes all the way down to townhomes. That's a reflection both of the realities of the constrained land supply in Lake Oswego and really all around the metro area. It leads to higher intensity use of the land. And then also we have recent statewide rules and laws coming through that encourage the building of plexes, duplexes to triplexes in single family zones. And so we are projecting a greater share of those middle housing types, middle density housing types in over this 20-year period. Next slide. Included in the report then is also an estimate of how that new unit need might break down among income groups going forward. So on the left-hand side there, you see a breakdown of incomes from extremely low income up to upper income. These are categories that come from HUD and are also commonly used by affordable housing programs. That's where these sort of terms come from, and also the ranges themselves. So you see the percentages of AMI next to it. That stands for area median income. Extremely low income households would be those earning less than 30% of the area median income, for instance. This is our estimated breakdown of those future units. On the right, you also see the types of common housing products that meet the needs of these different income units. This is not, it's not absolute. There's a lot of crossover and folks who find their own living situations, but this is sort of a generalization of what housing types might best serve them. The most important thing probably to remember here is that increasingly those in the low income and lower groups need some sort of subsidized housing in order to get units that are actually affordable to them. And if they don't have access to that, they often live in or really spending more of their gross income towards housing than is considered affordable or really sustainable. So those are the income groups that we really focus on in terms of needing some special subsidy or intervention, perhaps, to serve the needs of those groups. And the more upper income groups you're going to find are often served by the market itself, the private real estate development market. Next slide, I think talks a little bit more about this, but this is the basic idea: is that the private home building market is serving those in the middle to upper incomes. And as we go through this process and get into the housing production strategy, which comes after, it's really going to be more of those needs that are not being met by the market that we really need to focus on. That'll be the focus of future phases of this project. And I think that's my last slide. Yes. So I know I just covered a lot, but I'm happy to answer any questions and have any discussion you'd like.
Thank you very much. Commissioners, we have Commissioner Heap.
Thank you, Chair Leak. So yeah, a couple questions. The first question was on the slide you were just showing the 20-year housing forecast by income segments.
Could you go back to that slide? Thank
Yes,
you.
this one. Is there any data that shows how this is changing from the way it is today to how it will compare in the 20-year forecast? I mean, is there specific segments that we're anticipating changing more than others from the way it exists today?
Do you mean changing in terms of
Like share, percentage?
the
Yes.
share of how many of households? Yeah. We try to use a model that models some demographic changes in terms of especially age of householders and income, and try to use that as a proxy to model changes going forward. So this the share of households you see here does not actually match the current breakdown. It might be close, but this actually is hopefully showing what some of those expected changes might be. As you can imagine, it's very hard to project out 20 years from now. There's, it's a bit of a crystal ball, but this is the model that we use. This is the result.
It'd be
Is
interesting.
the question that it might be interesting to see what today's share is on the same breakdown?
Yeah, and the direction that it's going. For example, I mean, could it be that the upper income goes from, where it is today down to 49%, and the middle income increases? So, would it be worthwhile for the commission then to understand that maybe our upper incomes are decreasing and our middle incomes are increasing. And that's where we need to focus some of our attention in terms of planning and housing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Rigby, you have a question?
I had more, sorry.
Oh,
Drew.
I'm sorry.
I mean, going back to the initial first slides, I was just wondering on the sources, did the data incorporate any of the maybe more recent data? For example, the data that was coming out of the Census Bureau data. And in the initial slides, it was actually showing some population increase, but I think this is fairly recent, within the last couple of days or the week, that Oregon's overall population dropped by, I think, around 16,000 residents. And so is that new data that's maybe not being incorporated, or is that being taken into effect? And I have one more question after that.
Yeah, so this is the most recent population data we have was an estimate for 2022. That comes from Portland State's Population Research Center. They take the latest available census numbers, and then they have a methodology for looking at the number of units that have been built and these different factors to try to come up with an estimate each year. So there are, yes, there were multiple communities in the last estimates that are estimated to have lost population over the last year. Lake Oswego was not one of them. I think they said, I don't have it immediately in front of me, but I think they said that they grew, Lake Oswego grew by a few residents, but Portland represented a lot of the decrease, a large share of the decrease even statewide. And Hillsborough lost some population. So it's selected communities around the state, and then, as you mentioned, the state itself. But the latest forecast we have does not show that Lake Oswego actually lost population.
Yeah, and I would say to that point, Brendan, we've heard repeatedly that the amount of growth that we expect over a 20-year time frame, 411 new residents, seems much lower than we would ever expect. So, there might be some sort of recent, abnormalities in the data that are showing a bit of a decrease, but ultimately, I think looking at the long-term trends, a lot of folks do not expect even a modest increase, maybe a little bit more of an increase than we projected. So.
Especially when you take into consideration like the Merrillhurst affordable housing units that will be coming online. And
well, actually,
does that take that into
we look at that in the
consideration?
supply side. So this isn't really factoring in the supply of land here yet. This is just looking at housing needs based on our demographics and the population. So that's kind of what Andrew will get into a little bit more in the second part of the presentation. So this, I think some of those, if they've already been sort of planned for, they would be included in the supply side. Some of them are already included in this forecast, depending on if they're permitted yet or not, basically as of when we pulled this data late last year.
So anything that's not permitted is not part of the supply side statistics?
It would be part of our existing stock, not the supply. That's right, yeah.
If it's not permitted?
If it's not permitted, it would be a part of the supply, but if it is permitted, it would be a part of the existing stock. It's not our forecast, we already know that that's happening, so we put it into the baseline numbers.
Okay, Commissioner Rigby?
Oh, Commissioner, sorry, Shirley, just one final question. I was just continuing on my thoughts. Thank you, Commissioner Rigby.
Last one.
For reading this. So just following on to the last question about the population decrease, I think it would be interesting to study that, why Oregon lost 16,000. And I know across Oregon it's being asked, is it any way related to what's happening in Clark County, Washington, as Vancouver and Camas is increasing? And, some maybe ask, what's the economic impact of things like is happening with the metro income tax? So does that play, an effect? And I would think maybe Lake Oswego would be somewhat more susceptible to that type of impact from an economics perspective, as I personally know neighbors that have moved out of Lake Oswego for that reason.
I do not think that is accounted for in the numbers. Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie. That's all.
Thank you. Commissioner Rigby.
As we talk about the basis of what we're looking at in population here, you said, and it's the case, right, that we are constrained to working with the assumptions put forward in Metro's collaborative population forecast. That's correct?
Yes, that is a constraint. It's luckily their household forecast is higher. Otherwise, I think it would be even more of an issue. But yeah, the population number is very constrained at this point. And so it's important to remember that it doesn't come with any real constraint. So even if we adopt this plan and it has this low forecast in it, that in no way prevents any actual development activity or growth from happening in Lake Oswego. It's not a hard constraint, but it is a constraint on this analysis itself.
But you're saying we do have some leeway on interpreting and projecting the household needs.
Well, no, the number of households is also supplied by Metro, but because they're forecasting the household size to decrease so much, the average household size, then it amounts to the roughly 2,000 new housing units you see here.
Okay, so those numbers are not a factor of interpretation by your group. That just comes out of Metro's numbers.
Yeah. So the year 2043 number for population and number of households are coming from Metro and not from our interpretation.
I see.
And Commissioner Rigby, just one really quick, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Please.
But just wanted to point out, I think what Brendan's kind of pointing out is that regardless of the numbers that you see in the housing needs or housing capacity analysis, the city could take the initiative to say we have goals to produce more housing than, quote unquote, we think that are called for in terms of our need in this document. So we could take strategies that are a little bit more aggressive. I think that's more of kind of what he's trying to say.
Okay. I think I'm just trying to figure out where, what we are, what our mandate is from the state. And so am I right in saying that where we have leeway really is in terms of our response, in terms of how to, how to address those numbers?
Yes, yeah. So you definitely have the leeway to come up with your own policy and decide what these findings mean for you. We'll compare these to the buildable lands inventory to figure out sort of based on this forecast, does your current amount of sort of remaining residential land can it support this amount of growth or not? What you can't do, for instance, is say, we have, this report shows that we have a fairly low growth rate, but we want to add large amounts to the urban growth boundary. Then you might be in a situation where this analysis may not be as supportive of that, but we're still working. I don't want to preempt our findings or get out ahead of ourselves because we haven't gotten there yet. But it is possible to reach too far with a strategy, given what the results of this analysis is. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
And just to also tack onto that, when we're looking at the slide that we have up right now, are there requirements from the state in terms of our production related to producing units within those income bands?
There are not, except that the state is now discussing a new system, which may track housing production in each community in the state and sort of tap cities on the shoulder and say, hey, you're not getting the production of this kind of housing that it looks like you need. It's still unclear what that will mean necessarily, and what enforcement mechanisms the state might have, but basically, no, none of this commits the city to take extraordinary measures to actually get this developed, but it should encourage the city to look at tools and your zoning and ways to facilitate this type of development from others.
And just to, I guess, expand a bit on what Brendan was alluding to, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this recently, but just a bit of a refresher on the whole housing needs analysis program, if you will, at the state level. It's something that under House Bill 2003, we're going through. The last time we did an update, or the first housing needs analysis was in 2013, and we have not updated it since then. However, with House Bill 2003, we are required to come back every 6 years and update and go through the same process, update our housing needs analysis, take a look at the numbers again. And it is likely, as Brendan alluded to, that the next time we do this, we'll be under a bit of a new regime, what we call what the state is calling the Oregon housing needs analysis, sort of like a statewide look at the housing needs analysis. That would be, instead of, I guess, dictated by metros through our current process, or agreed upon with Metro rather, would be coming a bit more from the state. So we do expect that to be a different kind of program. Of course, we'll have to go back and revisit this again, so there'll be maybe some different parameters in terms of the data we're looking at there. But my sense, based on some discussions with our contact at DLCD, is that will be a little bit more aggressive than, again, this number that we're looking at from Metro.
And is there a House bill in front of the legislature now to instigate this particular?
Well, it was actually kind of initiated with the whole thing that we're doing right now. House Bill 2003 sort of set this Oregon housing needs analysis project in motion, and it's still being refined. So there are still some discussions going on at the state level about what this will look like. I think, I can get a little bit more detail on that for you, but I believe that's part of the HB 2001 amendments. I could be incorrect on that, but sort of a number of legislation. There are a number of different legislation packages at the state right now that have implications for a lot of things we do, and that's one of them that really is kind of clarifying a process that was outset back in 2019.
So how does the state mandate government subsidized voucher transitional aging substandard rentals? How does it mandate 21%?
Well, they're not.
I mean,
They're not
but
yet.
that's what you're saying it's going towards. That's like unfunded mandates. The city's supposed to buy the land and then.
We're just not there yet. Yeah, it's
Cross that bridge
unclear
when we
that it
come
will
to
go
it.
on like that. But generally speaking, I'm assuming it would be more aggressive, and money would be necessary for any subsidized housing. So.
Okay. Commissioner Phillips.
I have a clarity question, pretty quick answer, I believe, and then I have a question. All right, so is this the first time something like this has been done, or was it done 5 years ago and this is just a new addition, or?
Yeah, as I pointed out in the materials for tonight's meeting, we first went through and created our housing needs analysis as an attachment to the staff report tonight back in 2013. So we already have a housing needs analysis adopted as part of our comprehensive plan. So this would be an update to that housing needs analysis and the comprehensive plan. And we are kind of signed on for every 6 years going back and doing this again. So that's the new process.
Okay, sorry I didn't read close enough apparently, but okay, but my fundamental question is, okay, so let's say, first of all, I commend anybody that does these sort of things because, no plan survives the first encounter with the enemy, okay? So, and there's plenty of enemies out there to slow this down. So I commend you. It's difficult, it's impossible to predict. If we could predict, we wouldn't be sitting here, we'd be doing other things. So with all that said, my real question is, what what happens in 3 years if the population has increased by 7,000, okay? What are you going to do with this thing once you get it done? I mean, other than check a block and say we did what we're supposed to do, is there somebody going to be spending money, buying land, getting owners to sell, before, based upon this document? I don't believe that's going to happen. And so 3 years from now, if we got 7,000 people more than we thought we had, and these numbers are just not even close, I mean, if you could go down, it's easy. You got plenty of housing probably, okay? But what are we going to do with this thing once it's done, okay?
Well, to my point from a moment ago, we will have an opportunity in 6 years to come back and revisit this, of course. So, yeah, that is 6 years from now. But in the intervening 6 years, of course, there are some strong ties between this work and the housing production strategies work, which is going to shortly follow. So, really, a lot of this is up to us as a city. What policies do we want to execute? What is the timeline for executing those? What do we think is going to be the most effective, sort of the most impact for, our energy, if you will. So, a lot of that, we come up with that strategy. We tell the state we plan on doing X, X, and X within this time frame, and then they, more or less hold us to it. Of course, you're kind of speaking of a situation where there are more units needed than what we had originally anticipated. And under that circumstance, we could try to get out ahead of that with this current work for the housing production strategies, which would be kind of a direct follow-up to this work. Or we could adjust on the fly, of course. We could come up with new housing policy that says, hey, let's take a pause and take stock of the fact that this is happening way faster than we anticipated and develop policy from there. And, that's not completely unprecedented. There's obviously a lot of housing growth in the last, sort of 2018 through last year, this year even maybe, that a lot of that might not have been projected when we did our original work back in 2013. So, there have been some sort of interventions to say, hey, this is kind of a housing emergency at this point, maybe we should shift course. So, obviously middle housing wasn't something that we had envisioned as being a housing production strategy back in 2013 when we were looking at this, and a lot has happened since then. So, we want to get as much right about this document as we possibly can, but there's certainly, we're not limited by it unless we decide to take on some massive project that isn't going to be effective, I suppose, or something like that. But I'm hoping we won't get there. I'm hoping it'll be more opportunities than limitations, if that makes sense. But, to that point, we do have to really come up to the state and say, we agree that we're going to do this and put some timelines on it as well. So we want to make sure that it's manageable and feasible within the time frame that we're talking about.
Well, I don't want to appear negative, but, my question was based upon, I hope it works. I hope this is right on target, but, I don't see the system being flexible enough and nimble enough to deal with a rapid growth in population in Lake Oswego. I suspect it won't happen. They'll move to Sherwood and other places where they can afford, but that's a different issue.
That's a good observation, and that's certainly not inappropriate for folks such as yourself to point out to folks such as myself and the consultants, hey, this seems really low. I think we're going to see more, and that's kind of the input that we're looking for from you right now. So.
But we can't have more if we don't have the places to put them. I mean, 7,000 people can't move in the next 5 years because we don't have the housing stock to support it.
Well, we might in 5 years, but yeah, that's a great segue into talking about our land supply, which is the topic that Andrew was going to go in next, unless there are other questions prior to then.
Well, Commissioner Heap has one last question.
And maybe just one last comment. Again, I think it'll be interesting to see what segments change, because again, I think there may be some on the top end that actually decrease, and we're seeing some trends in Oregon where the population is going down, and I don't think that can be ignored again. And then just a comment on Commissioner Phillips' comments. I think we use this all the time, and I think we are fairly agile. As I was mentioning in the beginning of the call tonight, when we look at rezoning, we're basically adapting to things that are changing in our community and the needs. And when we say, well, maybe we need more affordable housing and more multiple family housing, we look at changing those zoning and making a recommendation on that as they come before us. So I do see us being as nimble as we can be, and I do see this data being very valuable, and especially understanding, recommendations we're making with zoning changes.
Thank you. Do you want to go ahead with the second segment?
Yes, thank you. I guess, Andrew, that is your cue.
All right, thank you very much, commissioners. Again, Andrew Parrish with MIG. I'm going to be talking about the residential buildable land inventory, which is the supply side of the equation that we're talking about here in terms of housing overall. So we've completed a draft of this report that should be in your materials. This slide outlines basically the big steps of what this analysis does. We look at what land in the city and in its kind of immediate surroundings, things with a city comprehensive plan designation, which of that land should be considered residential land. We look at constraints to development, so things like steep slopes, things like water bodies, things like the canopy regulations that the city has. Third step is we look at what's been built on the ground, what's developed, and what's vacant, and what's kind of in between vacant and developed, and that's kind of the interesting question always. And then lastly, we do some math to figure out what the net buildable area is for all that land, and what capacity should we really expect on all of that land using kind of the city's development code and expectations about how much right of way goes into certain kinds of development and that kind of thing. This map is the study area in this kind of black and white line here, and the yellow area is what's currently within the city limits. And so you'll see that there are parcels in our study area that, again, they do have City of Lake Oswego comprehensive plan designations, but they are not in the city limits today. But this is part of the planning area that we're looking at. As far as figuring out what should be considered residential, we've looked at the city's residential designations as well as mixed use designations. So this is just a map of comprehensive plan designations here. And this map is showing yellow as residential land. So in one of the city's residential designations, the purple is a mixed use designation. So we're considering that as residential, but we give it some kind of discount rate so that we can make assumptions about some portion of the development going to office or retail or other uses that aren't residential, and then some portion would be residential. And then the blue color are public and other designations, and then we have a couple of kind of commercial or industrial only designations in gray there. So this is the land base that we're working with. As we look at development constraints, the ones on this map are the ones we've taken into account, and there are various assumptions that are detailed in the memo in your packet, but things like steep slopes and floodplains and and water bodies are assumed to be pretty much undevelopable. But there are some of the city designations like the sensitive lands overlays that we've made some assumptions that some portion of that might be developable, just given the history of developing on those lands. So this equation essentially gets us an amount of developable acreage on every parcel in the city. So then we look at what's called development status. So this is where we put things into the category of vacant or developed or partially vacant. So vacant is generally pretty easy. We use tax assessor data for most of this. So if something has less than $20,000 of improvement value on a parcel, we say that's a vacant parcel. If something is and partially vacant is the one that has a lot of kind of caveats to it. So the intent is that we find lots that have an existing home, but large acreages kind of associated with it, that can reasonably be expected to subdivide and provide more housing. So, have a land division of some kind. And we've seen a number of these kind of developments occur in the city of Lake Oswego. So we've used some filters like improvement value for the home. So we'd say it's probably more likely to happen on a lower value home, that you would get some subdivision of the property. We've used some categories of whether zoning would allow, 5 more housing units or just 1 more housing unit. And so that's all detailed in the report. There's kind of a lot to go into. And middle housing, the city's middle housing rules have kind of further complicated things, because in theory, just about any single family lot can become a middle housing type, based on the new rules there. And so developed lots are pretty much everything else. And so the partially vacant category is an interesting one, and it is where there may be some capacity for the city to provide additional housing units. And so this map shows these designations. So the gray areas are basically the constraints, just to kind of show you where those are. Purple is land that is considered to be fully developed. Green is considered to be vacant. So you'll see it's kind of a scattered series of small lots throughout the city. There isn't a significant amount of vacant land in the city of Lake Oswego, which shouldn't be surprising for folks. And then this partially vacant category is the yellow lots, and these are generally the larger lots around town. And so what we've done with these is assume that about a quarter acre remains for the existing home, and the remainder is considered to be developable based on its zoning designation. And so I think one of the findings of this map in particular are one of the things that it should suggest is, maybe a question that should be asked is, how realistic is this? Is there a policy the city has or should have related to kind of land divisions on these properties, and what portion of the city's future development ought these parcels play?
Excuse me, Andrew, can you go back to that slide, please?
Yep.
So partially vacant means there's homes on it already, correct?
That's correct.
So you see the big swath up there, which is Forest Meadows. Those houses are on big pieces of land, but they possibly have CC&Rs that preclude them from being developed more densely. You made a blanket statement saying that any house in Lake Oswego could become middle housing. Not if it has grandfathered CC&Rs that preclude that from happening, correct?
I'd have to defer to Erik on that one.
That is correct, but of course the zoning is set up for the eventuality or possibility that could be dissolved at any point, but that is not included in this analysis in terms of that analysis of which specific parcels have HOAs that might have CC&Rs that would preclude middle housing. So that is something that we've been asked to look into a bit further. Of course, the city does not have our own resources to be able to do that level of analysis, so we'd have to look out for some outside help and probably do something a bit different to get that information. But it's certainly something that has been identified over and over again, and I think really depends on how much our strategy would really be focused around middle housing, because as you can notice, middle housing, we don't expect a ton of units of middle housing in the next 20 years, so it might not be the most aggressive form of housing production.
Okay. Commissioner Rigby, you had a quick question?
Yes, I noticed that this map appears to contain areas that are in the city's urban services area, but are not under city jurisdiction. I just want to ensure that those aren't being taken into account when looking at housing production.
So we're actually, they are taken into account, and we're required to take them into account. We're required to look at the entire urban growth boundary area that we've mapped for comprehensive plan, with with a comprehensive plan designation. So everything within the UGB would meet that category. Of course, we cannot consider that to be currently in the city, but we could see that as land that could help meet the city's housing needs in the future if it were annexed.
But the city doesn't have the leeway to change policy on those pieces of property at present.
We have the leeway to talk about our annexation procedure, different approaches that the city could take to our annexation practices. And, you know, I would say, again, we do have a comprehensive plan designation for those areas. The city has planned for those areas to some degree already in our comprehensive plan. So, you know, while we can't force those, you know, folks to come in and annex their properties, we do know we have a history of annexations in the city. We do know roughly the rate that they have come to us recently, and we might expect them to come to us in the future. So, you know, we're not completely shooting in the dark here, but we would, you know, to make some reasonable assumptions based on the past few years of activity.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to note for anyone looking at the map that, you know, isn't aware of that, you know, all of these designations don't necessarily mean that, for instance, what occurs to me is that in the upper northeastern corner there, quite a lot of that Birds Hill area is not currently part of the city, and it has a lot of that, what's labeled as the partially vacant land right now.
That's correct. Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner Stewart.
But isn't it true, though, that when properties in the urban services boundary redevelop, then if they connect to city services, then they get annexed?
Yes, properties within the urban growth boundary that aren't within the urban service boundary, if they are going to get annexed within the urban service boundary, we would require them to connect to services. Yeah.
So that would make sense to consider them in this study, because we're talking about properties that may get developed, and once they get developed, they would likely become part of the city.
Well, they might, but they don't have to.
Yeah, we're actually required to look at them, so just
yeah.
Like, they don't have to connect to the sewer, for instance.
Yeah, they do.
They should.
If they want to
if
do
they're
that.
going to be annexed, then they would. Yeah.
Yeah, if they're, well, but
Well, that's true.
the opposite of
because
what we're talking about.
if the sewer is not within 300 feet of the property or whatever, I mean, whatever. Okay, moving right along.
Again, that, you know, we would assume there would be less likelihood for annexations to develop in those scenarios, but we still need to look at the possibility, and we do see them fairly often. So.
And I'll note that the inability to serve land with utilities is like a reason why you can make certain assumptions about developability of some land, but you have to kind of make findings that there's no way that services could be provided here. And I think the expectation is that everything within the urban growth boundary is anticipated to, you know, urbanize to some degree over the 20-year period, and that's sort of the reason for the urban growth boundary being where it is. But all good points, and, you know, annexation policy and the particularities of different neighborhoods are certainly aspects of what we want to kind of address in this analysis, and get a sense of what's realistic and what's not, so that the city can make good decisions about how to accommodate future housing needs. So yeah, thanks for your comments so far, and look forward to some more as well. Just to kind of round it out here, after we look at the development status, we look at what's the net buildable area for these parcels, and what kind of expectations that we have for their development capacity. So we usually use something like 20% of a takeoff for future right-of-way, stormwater infrastructure, et cetera. For partially vacant properties where we wouldn't expect kind of new roadways to occur, we can go ahead and say there isn't going to be that set aside there. And then we've got some assumptions based on the zoning code or comprehensive plan designation that we've worked on with the city. So this table provides the initial results of our analysis. Essentially, we see about 1,400 units of capacity on about 360 acres in the what I'll call kind of the raw land, but we know that there are some other categories of land that sort of aren't accounted for in this process. One of which is the Marylhurst University kind of development approval. There's a little bit of capacity left there, about 70 units that was approved that have not yet been built. And again, back to middle housing, we've made an assumption that about 3% of developed lots with single detached dwellings could kind of subdivide internally or add another unit onto the property based on the city's recent middle housing rules, and that adds another about 400 units to the city. We haven't yet looked at redevelopment on multifamily land or mixed use land. So oftentimes we'll look at what we call a strike price. So if the value of the property per square foot is below a certain value, we would say maybe that is a site that is ripe for redevelopment. We can, older structures or lower value structures, and potentially looking at converting office uses to residential uses is something else we could be looking at. So that might be a source for additional capacity in certain areas, but we haven't really taken that step yet. But if we take all of that into account, we're looking at about 1,875 units. We haven't yet broken that down into what types of units those are what proportion of them are expected to be single family versus kind of attached middle housing versus multifamily products. But this is kind of the initial analysis that we have, and this table breaks this down into zoning designations, and you'll see the R10 and R7.5 comprehensive plans. Those indicate areas that are outside the city today. So those are just areas with a comprehensive plan designation and not a city zoning designation. Again, this is the initial analysis, and we invite more conversation and questions here. Hopefully I can answer some.
I will just say I've already noted your suggestion for information on CC&Rs. I'm assuming that was a suggestion of yours.
Numbers, go to the title company and find out, what the CC&Rs are. That's time consuming, I get it.
But hey, we've gone to 3 different parties and we've heard it 3 different times already. So it's important for us to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, otherwise neighborhoods feel targeted when there really should be off limits. Do we have any other questions or comments for the presenters? Commissioner Stewart.
I'd heard you say just a short while ago that you haven't really gotten into sort of the analysis of the mixed use zones. I would say one thing that's, and you've probably seen this already, one thing that's a little maybe unique about Lake Oswego is if you look at the the areas that you're designating as mixed use, particularly those along Cruise Way and along Boone's Ferry and Lake Grove. And I'm looking at it, actually the earlier map that had just the that one. That's right. Along those 2 corridors, those are primarily currently commercial uses, and along Cruise Way they're primarily office. And I know there's a new residential development happening sort of on the western edge.
Meadows Way.
Right, Meadows Way, or I guess it is Meadows Way. But right now, it's very heavily commercial and office, where, a lot of times when we think of mixed use, it's got more of a residential slant to it. So I think, with the practices of offices and things like that, with people beginning or continuing to work from home, there may be more opportunity for residential use in the future along Cruise Way, just, I don't know, just depending on how trends go, I guess, but that's something maybe to consider, that there might be extra residential potential there.
Yeah, great to note. And you know, just in kind of comparing this to the needs forecast, you know, you think about the kinds of units that would be delivered by that sort of redevelopment, and it's mainly multifamily units. Maybe there could be some subsidy as part of some of those developments, but you wouldn't, for example, be seeing a lot of single family development come from that, come from those types of locations. So that's the kind of thing that we'll be trying to roll into the analysis.
Yeah, that's an exact type of input that we've given the consultants at some point already in this process. Like, did you know that some of these office buildings are interested in becoming residential? Maybe we should look into that here. So we hope to dig in a little bit further before we release the final versions of these documents in a couple of weeks here.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions by the commissioners? Commissioner Rigby?
If I could just comment on, you know, the approach going forward, making the final document. I think from my perspective, looking at this process, we're engaged in this process because it's mandated by the state. You know, it's not coming out of grassroots from residents here. And, you know, we need to put our full and complete cooperation into doing what's required of us. But I don't think it would be right or representative of the residents to do more than what we are required to do. You know, if something comes, you know, organically out of the city that, you know, is saying we want to, you know, jam in a lot more housing units than we're required to, than these numbers are telling us to, that's one thing. But, you know, I doubt we're likely to see that from Lake Oswego residents. And
the
you know,
market,
I don't think it would be fair to
market
them.
isn't going to build those, because that's not what the market is used to building here, unless it's subsidized or mandated or
And that
incentivized.
seems like it would take a lot
Yes.
of heavy lifting from the city.
That's
So
just my 2 cents.
We do have a couple just slides with next steps, if you don't mind, just to finish this off, to tell
do it.
people what they can key into in the next couple of weeks. So yeah, Andrew.
This is actually the last slide here, so I can.
Oh,
Yeah,
no worries.
why don't you just speak to it here?
Yeah, no problem. I guess this is kind of like a schedule update as well. But essentially, as I mentioned, we do have that online open house. So I'd encourage you to get that out to your networks if you can. Encourage folks to fill out that survey and look at that content. We will also be coming back next Tuesday to the City Council for a similar presentation with Brendan and Andrew. Additionally, I would sort of point out that we are expected to come back to the Planning Commission for a hearing to adopt a revised version of these documents on July 24th. So that's kind of where we have that slotted currently. I'm also hoping to essentially add an update to the Planning Commission's agenda for May to just basically give a little bit of an update on what we've heard from these various different parties that we've spoken to in terms of input for the housing capacity analysis and BLI, and some changes that you might expect with those draft documents, or I'm sorry, the final versions of those documents from the drafts. So really, you know, what we're going to do right now is take stock of everything we're hearing, try to kind of make any tweaks that we've heard are needed to those two documents, and then reconcile them more or less, take a look at that supply and the demand side, and sort of weave those together into a final housing needs analysis report, and that'll be the sort of next iteration of this that you'll be seeing. So again, I will be back here talking to you about kind of some of the tweaks that we anticipate to make with an update before then, but the next phase will be to consider this for adoption on the 24th of July.
Thank you. Can you tell me where we would take this survey, or where the survey, is there a link somewhere?
Yeah, you know, we sent out links to all the boards and commissions recently. We've sent out a lot of emails about this, but I'm happy to redistribute it to the Planning Commission. It's on the website. for this project. It's an online open house. I don't know if you want me to read out the URL necessarily, but I will make sure that it's distributed when I get back to my computer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have, I think we're finished with this segment of our work session. Is that accurate?
That's all we have for you tonight. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other business that needs to be brought up before the commission? Seeing none, we've already had a partial schedule review. Did you want to go into anything further?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a bit about the rest of the month. So reminder that we are going to be reconsidering findings for the ministerial mitigation project that was put on hold essentially last October. So on the 24th of April, that will be something that will be before the commission, is to look at those findings, consider them for adoption, to then move on to council for a hearing. We'll also on April 24th be having our next work session on the psilocybin time, place, and manner regulations. So that will be the bulk of our agenda that day. I wanted to mention May 8th. It looks like we're going to cancel that date. So really this is kind of, I just wanted to talk about this with the commission, I suppose, because, you know, obviously with, you know, having one less staff member, we have fewer people to be able to take items to the commission. So I know we have some capacity as a commission, but in terms of staff capacity to bring items to you, it is somewhat lower at this moment. So we are proposing to cancel the meeting on the 8th, at least for the sort of interim situation we're in, as long as that sounds okay to you all. So if there are any objections, please let me know if there's something that you'd like to cover during that meeting. Otherwise, I'm planning on the 22nd to provide that update I was just speaking about on what we've heard so far from folks in the community and City Council and the task force about the initial housing needs analysis documents. And, you know, I guess that brings us up to speed to the end of May, at least. So
Psilocybin will be on April
24th.
Okay, thank you.
And I think Commissioner Afghan mentioned this, but I just wanted to give a bit of an update that the South Shore rezoning, as I think you know, Commissioner Heap at least has noted, was approved by council. So they did direct staff to write findings, conclusions in order for them to consider on the 18th. So just a sort of check in on that. That will be coming to them next Tuesday as well.
Great, thank you very
Let me just
much.
emphasize, for those commissioners who were not present during the ministerial mitigation, you'd want to review the record in order to participate. It's not, you don't, I mean, it's, I think you'd want to. It's not mandated that you, if you don't participate, then that's, and you abstain, and that's counted as a no vote. Okay, so.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's not common that we put something on hold for this long, so we'd ask that you look at the record again if you have a chance.
Go back and review. Okay. That being said, with no other business to attend, Commissioner Heap?
I was just going to give some feedback to Planner Manager Olson. Actually, the week of May 8th, I think it's good to take off just because that's a popular week for college commencements. And I know there'll be several people traveling out of town. I'll be one. So, yeah.
Yeah, not that this is actually pertinent, but my mom's birthday is on the 8th, Mother's Day is the day before, and my wife's birthday is also on the 7th. So important for me.
Busy time. You need some time off. Okay, perfect. Seeing no other business to attend to, I call this meeting adjourned.